electroshock therapy is useful in calming disturbed patients. So are sedative packs.
The history of mental illness and its treatment in Western Australia dates back to 1865, when the Fremantle Lunatic Asylum was opened. I'm standing at Heathcote Point, and the history of this site dates back to 1827, when Captain James Stirling led an exploration of the Swan River. The first man to set foot on the south side of the river was Midshipman Heathcote, and so this place got its name. Today, it's the remains of a mental institution. Patients at Heathcote came from all walks of life and often included teenagers as inmates. People from other hospitals were also admitted here, and often these people were terminal cases, so the atmosphere at Heathcote could have been pretty intense at times.
I'd stared at the building and had seen it as an imposing building, but it was just a complete shock to see it from the inside.
Ironically, now a toy library and playgroup headquarters, Swan House used to be the locked facility at Point Heathcote Mental Institution. It was where people could be detained for up to 6 months, and also where electric shock therapy was administered to people suffering from depression.
They would be strapped down to a bed, shackled to a bed. Their feet and their arms were tied, and there was probably a doctor and a nurse in the room with the patient delivering the shock therapy, and it didn't last for very long at all. But the patient, you could see them trembling on the bed as they were receiving that shock therapy. And then afterwards they were taken to another section of the ward, and they just slept and slept and slept.
This was designed to remove depression from the brain, but frequently it left people totally debilitated, not even able to tie up their shoelaces. In here also was solitary confinement. This was the place that people were sent as a punishment. For instance, somebody who was anorexic, who lost weight rather than gained it, was put into solitary confinement. And in solitary confinement, they simply had a bed. There was one window high up. There was no reading material, nothing to stimulate them at all.
I did see some patients in a padded cell that were in straitjackets, and it was cruel. And it must have been my first or second day there, and I was completely terrified and bewildered by the whole situation. I'd never seen anything quite like it.
When I had a breakdown, I went to Charlie Gardner first, and I was put into Heathcote after about a month. So I was hospitalised first and then went to Heathcote.
It was scary. I mean, you know, he couldn't put his shoes on, he couldn't do anything, and it's sort of like 24/7 care, and it was scary to know if he was ever going to come back to being Keith. It was terrifying, yeah. There's no out. You go in and you stay there. You go locked in, and you know, with the nurses in the glass cabinets watching you. And I used to go in all day and come home after tea time. But no, you don't. There's no out. If you're in the major locked wards, it's 20 beds alongside, in rows in a big dorm, and you have a cabinet for your personal items. You know, one drawer, one cupboard, and then you have nursing staff sitting in the corners, and there's no out.
By the 1950s, Heathcote was always full. It took 45 male patients, 45 female, and there were 22 in the locked ward in Swan House. Short staffing made it very difficult. There were 3 staff on each ward during the day and the afternoon, and only 2 each night. And many of those staff had no medical training whatsoever. Even up into the late 20th century, the fear and misunderstanding of mental illness was great among the public, and the worry and concern about going into a place like Heathcote was terrifying, and if you had to resort to being admitted to a mental hospital, then the stigma attached to that was enormous.
Well, this is perhaps the thing that I remember most, is the tower. I mean, looking at it now, it looks rather terrific, but for me it was actually a kind of looming presence, because there were gates there. I think I only came here the once. My mother was here, I don't know how many times, at least 6 and probably more, because when we were very young, it was only years later that I discovered that it wasn't just postnatal depression that my mother was suffering from. It was issues in her life going right back to her when she was a young girl of 18 especially. So clearly I think she probably had postnatal depression, with each child, three children.
The reason Point Heathcote was chosen as the location for a place to bring the mentally ill for healing was quite simply that up on this promontory it had magnificent views, it was surrounded by beautiful woodland and plants. This was all felt to be part of the healing process. But it didn't help the neighbours next door, who felt very threatened by the thought of having a mental institution next to their property. And indeed, right up to the 1970s, when there were stories of people escaping from the locked section of this building and climbing the wireless tower on Wireless Hill, that fueled people's fears about having the mentally ill close to them.
Perhaps the worst part for me is the notion of experimenting with people. A practice that now doesn't occur, a leucotomy, the extreme form is a lobotomy. My mother had that, and I remember as an 11-year-old feeling deeply, deeply anxious that they were going to do something to her. For me, it was a kind of prison, and one that I didn't have access to, and that other people had control of my mother, but that would be normal for any kid when mum disappears periodically. So the building, when you think about it, it's like something out of a film. Here's this big tower on a headland, which you go past and you can't get in because there are gates. So, I mean, you'd like it to be a bit more anonymous, because the notion that up on the hill is a mad person.
The staff, doctors and patients, without exception, are kindness itself. So the people there have every chance of returning to normal good health.
When we came into government in 1993, I considered that this site and the one opposite, that is the Sunset site in Dalkeith, were the two most outstanding sites on the Swan River. I just love this place. I mean, you just look across at the most beautiful vista of the river, up and down the river, across to Kings Park and through to the city. I do believe it is important that we understand what it was used for, we understand the heritage of the site, and it's wonderful to see not only the public access today, but people who previously were involved here being able to come here and walk through and see what it is now being utilised for.
The hospital finally closed in 1996, And it was West Australian Premier Richard Court who made the decision to have these buildings converted into something with a community use. So today we have a museum, a cafe, a playgroup, and many other activities taking place here, including this magnificent play area. So somewhere that once held fear for the entire community is now a place of joy and healing.
A little bit of heaven fell out of the sky one day and it landed on a hilltop right here in WA. There are some who don't know it. It's sort of hidden but not remote. I'm referring to the haven, the wonderful Heathcote.